Good day to you, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Paul, and today's video is all about AMD's new Radeon R9 290X. This is our second video on the 290X, so in keeping with that theme, I'm using two of them. As you can see, I've got a two-way Crossfire configuration right here in our test bed behind me. Today's video is all about this and the benchmarks thereupon, so we're going to jump right into it. So I've got the 270X, or at least a version here from Asus. I've also got a 280X version here from MSI, so two of these and two of these and two of these, and I also included one of these. Folks, some benchmarks, including some two-way Crossfire configurations for AMD's latest R9 series of graphics cards. Now, what can we derive from this information? Well, we can see that Crossfire scaling is pretty good across the board. At least if you're going to be going with a couple 290Xs, you should see some very nice performance, especially if you're moving from 1 to 2. Of course, as with most Crossfire configuration, it is not going to scale in a linear fashion. You're probably going to get anywhere from 90% all the way down to 0%, depending on the game you're using and the software. And that is a point I always want to make when I'm talking about two-way video card configurations, two-way or more. It is a nice way to get a lot of performance, a lot of bang for your buck. For instance, a couple 270Xs or a couple 280Xs are going to be much less expensive than some of the top-tier cards that are currently available. However, the trade-off is always going to be you need driver support, you need software support, and then you also have some other things to consider. So a couple of those is going to be temperature and noise. Now, you might have noticed in my original 290X video, as well as this 290X video, I haven't had any temperature slides. I do that sometimes, but the reason was, after measuring these cards, these slides would all be the same. These cards are designed to run at 95 degrees Celsius. That's actually the temperature target, and that's actually what these cards will try to do almost with any game that you throw at them. So once you have a 3D game running, you'll see those temperatures start to climb up. Now, some folks have looked at that and said that is a bad thing. It's not really a bad thing. It's by design. That's the way AMD designed these cards, and from the reps we have spoken with, they will happily run at that temperature for the entire duration of their lifespan, which should be plenty of time. Now, one thing to keep in mind, since they are going to be running hotter, is that if you have them in an enclosed system versus the open test bed that I've been using right here, you will want to make sure that you have plenty of airflow. So make sure you have at least 1 or 2 intake fans and at least 1 or 2 exhaust fans that are going to move the air at a fairly steady pace through your case, and that'll help you deal with those increased temperatures. But don't worry about it running warm. Again, that's just how it's designed. Acoustics is another thing that often comes into play when you're talking about building your own computer. And as anyone who has played a very quiet game will tell you, that having a quiet computer to go along with it is a very nice thing to have. Now, I don't really have scientific tests. We're working on getting that set up here at Newegg TV, but we don't have that yet. So I'm going to do this very subjective test by turning myself towards the system right here and letting you guys listen for just a moment. Now, bear in mind, this is idle. But under the default configuration for these cards, they're only going to spin up to about 40% of their fan speed. If you're going for something beyond that, like you're playing around with the overclocking stuff like I did in the first video, then feel free to crank that fan target speed up. You will get more noise, but you'll get better cooling as well, but it's a fun way to play around with what these cards can do when you're not really concerned about how much noise they're making, just about how well they can be cooled. And I can say these coolers do a good job at keeping these cards at actually 94 degrees, not 95. It keeps it just a notch under that target temperature. But the third thing I wanted to talk about is power draw, because you are going to draw more power using 2 cards than you will with 1. For this one, I have a slide. So here we can see all 4 cards or card configurations that I tested, and as you might tell, looking at the single 290X at the top versus the dual 290Xs down at the bottom, you're seeing somewhere around 200 watts more power drawn when you're under full load, and that's sort of goes hand in hand with the TDP of the card, how much power is being drawn. Your mileage may vary to some degree. However, I did want to point out when you're down and only at idle, or you're actually not using the cards for 3D anything, the cards actually only draw about 90 to 110, maybe 120 watts at most under the two-way configurations. That is largely in part due to AMD's power tune functionality, and particularly when you're idling or just doing 2D stuff, it will often actually disable and turn off the cores and the fans from one of the cards, which is a great way to save power. But there's a look at kind of the difference in power consumption that you're going to be looking at if you're jumping from a single card to a 2-card configuration. So now that we've discussed a little bit of the downside of running a 2 or more graphics card configuration, let's talk about the upside, and let's talk about some extremely high resolution gaming, because if you read some of the marketing materials that AMD has come out with the R9 290X, that's really what they're gearing this card towards, is beyond 1080. So we've got your 2560 by 1440 monitors that are out there. That's 16:9 aspect ratio. You've also got panels like the NEC ones that we're using over there, the 30-inch 2560 by 1600 monitors, which are awesome and beautiful. However, that aspect ratio and that resolution isn't catching on quite as much as the industry has expected it to. What they're really looking forward to is 4K. Now, 4K resolution, depending on which resolution you're going for, is something in the high 3000s range, 3800 to 4000 by about 2000 resolution. And if you multiply those together, that will give you about 8 million pixels that your graphics cards are trying to deal with. Now, we don't have a 4K monitor here at Newegg TV as of yet. However, I did sort of simulate something in that range by combining all 3 of our NEC 30-inch monitors together. So combining those all together gives you 7680 by 1600 resolution across 3 panels. It's quite a nice gaming experience, especially if you have the graphics chops to pull it off. And I ran just a few benchmarks at that resolution to give you guys a bit of an idea of what kind of performance you can get out of the R9 290X. Now, bear in mind, we're dealing with 4 million more pixels than 4K. 4K is about 8 million. We're dealing with about 12 million pixels here. So this is a fairly simple slide, but basically I ran BioShock Infinite, Battlefield 3, and Crysis 3 all at 7680 by 1600. What I was trying to do is see if I could get 30 frames per second or better, or more ideally 60 frames per second or better. I was definitely able to surpass 30 frames per second. As you can see with the two-way configuration, I hit 37 frames per second with BioShock Infinite, about 52 frames per second with Battlefield 3, and about 37 frames per second again with Crysis 3. Now, I run these games at very, very high resolutions with all of the eye candy and anti-aliasing, for example, turned up. So one thing I wanted to check was, could I get a more playable frame rate by dialing down some of those things? So with Crysis 3, by turning the motion blur down to low, turning lens flares off, putting the game effects to high instead of ultra, and turning the shadows and water down to medium, also running 8x anisotropic filtering instead of 16x, and high textures, I was able to get 55 frames per second, but 32 frames per second minimum. So that was a great example, and actually a very nice playing experience if you're okay with 30 frames per second. If you're going for 60 frames per second at this resolution, you're probably going to need to turn some of those eye candy features down a little bit. Now, I would be remiss if I did a Crossfire video with the R9 290Xs and didn't point out this little feature to you. Whether you want to call it a feature or an upgrade or a downgrade, that's all up to you, but there are no more Crossfire bridges. As you can see, these cards are communicating Crossfire-wise through the PCI Express bus, which there's plenty of bandwidth available to do. So the Crossfire contact points that you might recognize from older cards are no longer there, although you can kind of see some of the pinouts that would have been there on the board. And don't worry, we didn't forget the Crossfire bridge. It's just not necessary anymore for the 290X, as well as the 290 once it releases. And that is going to wrap it up for this video, guys. Once again, we've been taking a closer look at AMD's new Radeon R9 290X in a two-way Crossfire configuration. As you can see, it performs very well, particularly if you're dealing with higher resolutions such as 2560 by 1600 or even 7680 by 1600. Hopefully we'll get a 4K monitor in here soon so we can share some of those benchmark numbers with you guys as well. That's about it for our coverage for the time being, but I'm really curious to see what else you guys might want to see with these cards. You might notice, apart from the two that are installed right here, I've got a third right here. Might be able to get my hands on a fourth, maybe? Four-way Crossfire? That's a possibility in the future. Or any other implementations, games you might want to see played. I can't promise I'll do everything, but I will do as much as I possibly can to give you guys all the info you need about the R9 290X. Don't forget to leave me some feedback down in the feedback section down there. A like or a dislike or a comment is always much appreciated. Thank you very much for watching. We'll see you next time.